We're going to carry straight on, folks, so sorry for the quick turnarounds up here, but we're moving now into session 3, which is looking at global challenges and national priorities, the changing landscape for interdisciplinary research. And this is picking up really on the some of the things I touched on very briefly in my opening remarks this morning. A form of localized turbulence, if you like, and also opportunity in the reforms that are currently going through here in the UK research system, the creation of UKRI, and a scaling up of the level of ambition and resource going into large-scale, challenge-oriented research programs of various kinds. The Global Challenges Fund, the Industrial Strategy Challenges Fund, foremost among them. So we've got 4 excellently placed speakers to guide us through that changing landscape and relate it to some of the broader policy and societal challenges that we've been talking about so far this morning. I'm only going to introduce the speakers very briefly because you've got full bios in the pack and we'll keep more time for discussion. But we're going to hear first from JoAnn Elliott, the Chief Executive of ESRC. And JoAnn, I don't think you were here this morning for me to thank you and ESRC for making all of this possible in terms of ESRC's funding for the 3 centres and the Nexus Network. After Jane, we're going to hear from Dame Athene Donald. Athene is Master of Churchill College, an eminent soft matter physicist, but here in part in her role as chair of a new interdisciplinary advisory group that HEFCE has set up to inform those debates in the lead up to the next REF, the next Research Excellence Framework. We are then going to switch focus slightly to the demand side or within government for all of this policy and challenge-oriented research and hear from Ian Boyd, Chief Scientific Advisor at Defra. Ian's been CSA there for 5 years, has just recently announced he's stepping down later this year. And then finally, we're very pleased that JoAnn Lighty has joined us from the US National Science Foundation to give a perspective from the States on the way they, as very large, one of the main funders in the US system, are approaching these kinds of issues, and a turbulent time for the NSF too, as the budget settlements for the various bits of the US system are, I think, emerging almost literally as we sit here. So we're going to run through the speakers as before, short opening remarks, and then hopefully some time for discussion and questions from all of you. Start with Jane.
Thank you very much to James. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon, and I was sorry to miss this morning, but it's such an interesting panel discussion about Brexit. And this now feels a little bit more sort of local and less political. But what I wanted to do was to sketch out for you what some of the real changes are in the landscape for research and collaboration. And then secondly, to highlight 2 or 3 points that really struck me from the Nexus report that's being launched today and draw those 2 together. But I'll be very brief. And I'm also very aware from all the contributions so far that this is a very broad audience. And so I'm going to try my best to spell out all the acronyms because this seemed to be a very acronym-heavy session. So for those of you who are not going through the turbulent times of being within the research councils, you may not know that UK Research and Innovation hasn't been set up yet. It was, in a way, instigated by the Paul Nurse review of the 7 research councils. And Paul Nurse was asked to look at how the research councils and the funding system in the UK could evolve to better meet the needs of the UK and global research needs. And as a result of that, he reported in November 2015, and we're now going through the parliamentary process to set up UKRI, which is going to be an amalgamation of the 7 research councils together with Innovate UK, providing support and funding for business and for part of HEFCE. And I sometimes describe my job when people ask me how I'm enjoying it as a bit of a roller coaster. And I would say, the low points of the job are when we are considering organisational design and organisational change. The high points, though, that there have been over the last 2 or 3 years are the additional funding that there has been for more interdisciplinary research. So at the same time that Paul Nurse's report was coming out in the late autumn of 2015, we were having the announcement from David Cameron of the Global Challenges Research Fund. And I'd like to just spend a couple of minutes talking about the GCRF, because this is a substantial additional element of funding for the UK research system. So overall, it's £1.5 billion over 5 years. It's wedge-shaped, so in its first year, which was 16-17, it was about 100 million, and it goes up to £500 million. So really substantial funding, and specifically focused on work that counts as official development assistance. So any research and scientific work that is going to improve the well-being and development of people in developing countries. And the reason that this is so relevant to today's conversations is that all the discussions that there have been about how to make sure that that GCRF funding is strategically deployed has focused on the need to look at the nexus. So we've got the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that we need to look at the nexus between those 17 goals, and it's there that the Global Challenge Research Fund can be really beneficial. The research councils individually have already been allocated some of that Global Challenge Research money and have already done a great deal of work being collaborative and launching calls for collaborative work. And I just wanted to highlight one for you because I think it exemplifies this idea of looking at the nexus and the importance of interdisciplinary work and bringing together different constituencies. So the Economic and Social Research Council, where I'm Chief Executive, has clubbed together with the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and last summer we launched a call for projects looking at the problems around forced displacement. And there were a couple of projects that we funded there that particularly caught my eye. These have just started. They started in November 2016. But there was one where the PI is at the University of East Anglia, which is all about forced displacement and vulnerability to hazards in Colombia. So you can see there the sort of nexus between political upheaval, forced displacement, but then the individual vulnerability that results from people moving into different areas where there's environmental hazards. Another one that caught my eye, where the PI is Jamie Cross in Edinburgh, and he's a social anthropologist, and this is work on energy and forced displacement, and looking at the energy needs and energy policies in refugee camps. So again, to me, this is a real clear sort of practical question where you need to bring in very different disciplinary perspectives. And in addition, bringing in not just researchers, but practitioners, policymakers on the ground. So that's a collaboration with the Moving Energy Initiative as well. So those hopefully give you a flavour of some of the things we're doing with this additional funding. So just to close, 2 or 3 comments about some of the things that really spoke to me from the Nexus report. So one was that we started the Nexus with this sort of narrow idea of food, energy and water being connected. It's a bit naughty of me to say that's narrow, isn't it? But you know what I mean. And one of the messages that comes through in the report is that that needs to be much more widened. And I hope you can see from some of those projects from the GCRF that we're thinking as research councils about how we need to really broaden out this idea of the nexus and how we have to bring in social science alongside practitioners and the natural sciences to work on these areas. Second thing that came through for me was the importance of transdisciplinary research, and I like the way that there's a very clear definition of transdisciplinary research in the report, and that it's very much about bringing people together from different sectors and the idea of the co-design and co-production of research questions. So the importance of transdisciplinary research is really stressed, but also the idea that it takes time. And this brings me to my final point, which in a way is our conundrum as research councils. Because I think what our unique selling point is as research councils is that we've got longevity, we've got stability. We fund things for the longue durée. ESRC's been going for 50 years, the Medical Research Council for over 100 years. We typically give grants of 3 to 5 years. People can depend on us. But we've got to counterbalance that with agility. That one of the things that came through and really provoked the Paul Nurse report was this sense that we're all living in turbulent times, and we therefore need to be much more agile as researchers and research funders and making sure that we're investing in things. And that's where there's also this conundrum that we know that transdisciplinary research, collaboration across different boundaries, whether they're disciplinary, national, or between sectors, it takes time to build those relationships. So we've got to give it time, but we haven't got any time if we're going to be agile. So I'd like to leave you with the thought that in turbulent times, we need to be adventurously and ambitiously agile. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jane. We'll move straight on to Athene.
Thank you. Well, I should say, to start off with, James asked me, as soon as he discovered I was chairing this interdisciplinary advisory panel, my panel doesn't exist yet. I think the letter's going out at this moment, so I'm perfectly free to talk, because, of course, as soon as we start existing, I will be, have confidentiality agreements to worry about. So these are only my personal views. And again, to build on what Jane said about acronyms, so the panel I'm involved with is for the REF, which is the Research Excellence Framework. It is the 7-year framework in which research in universities is judged. And as such, I think it's only become more and more obvious that what the REF does and its predecessor, the RAE, it incentivizes the way research is done. So I would say in previous 7-year cycles, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary research, and I think the language really does matter, I would say has been undervalued. And that has caused universities also to undervalue it. I would also say, despite Jane being on my right, that I think the research councils historically have not done a very good job. I am perfectly sure the reason I've been asked to chair this advisory panel is I've spent the last 20 years complaining. I mean, I haven't complained about ESRC because I'm a physicist, and what I've specifically been looking at is the interface between the EPSRC, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council, because that's where my research is. And at one point, the BBSRC said to me, oh, well, we can't worry about that interface because we'd have to worry at every interface. And I thought, that is not an answer to the question I am posing. So my role is clearly going to be to try and crack this nut. And I am sure whatever I do, someone will hate me for it. And someone will tell me I've got it wrong. But it really matters. And I think the first thing we have to worry about is the language. Having read the definitions in the report, they're not the ones I would have used. That doesn't matter in one sense, but what matters is that they are absolutely spelt out. And I think that some people mean that interdisciplinary is a theoretical physicist working with an experimental physicist. I don't really think that's a very good example. And we have to know what we mean by these different terms and then make sure that what we're incentivizing is what we mean to incentivize and everyone understand things. I think, as I say, historically, when people have submitted research to previous REF and RAEs, they tended to submit to one so-called unit of assessment. And if they flagged that it was interdisciplinary, then a second one sort of looked at it on the side and he somehow agreed to score. And I was on the 2008 physics panel, and I know that's pretty much what happened. That's not what interdisciplinary research is all about. And when I was sent my initial terms of reference for this panel, it said, oh, we should have champions on every panel to champion for interdisciplinary research. And I thought, no, that's still missing the point, because as soon as one person takes responsibility and everyone else isn't interested, it's not going to work. So we have real issues in how to make sure that we can get a system that does work. And yet, from everything we've heard today, it is so clear how much the real societal challenges rely on this kind of work. And so we've now got this curious kind of tension where universities are still going to be driven by which department you're in when it comes to teaching. We're nothing like as good as America at having joint appointments and everything. So universities are still going to be thinking in this silo mentality, and yet the challenges and increasingly the funding are not going to be associated with that way. So it will be interesting times, turbulent times ahead, absolutely. There is one final point I'd like to make about science, which James will appreciate. Science does not mean natural science. And I think we do singularly lack the right language in this country. Wissenschaft is a much better term than science, because people immediately assume science is about Large Hadron Collider or something. And I think also we have a problem with the word culture. We haven't heard culture mentioned much today, but the AHRC defined culture in quite a narrow way, and which sort of excludes what I call science. So I get equally frustrated by that. So the AHRC put out a report last year, or earlier this year, sorry, the Cultural Value Project, which talked about culture and absolutely did not mean science. And I think this is also a real problem. So we have language problems. We have issues about how to measure things. And I think we have to be very careful about measuring things with metrics. Because if you start saying, I mean, you can say 1 million trees, as we heard in the earlier session, and that's a nice round number and everyone knows what it means. But if you're trying to measure the value of interdisciplinary work, it's very hard to quantify. So one final point before I close, the REF is not just about research papers, it is also about so-called impact. And impact was something that was introduced in the last round. It was often very narrowly translated. Everything we're talking about today is about impact, but it was often translated as economic impact. And it was to be impact derived from a scientific paper, scientific loosely defined, but a paper, a single research output. And very often, the impact derives from a whole body of work, and then you use the skills you've got from that to synthesize something that's actually utterly different. So why do I chair the Scientific Advisory Council for the Department of Culture and Media and Sports? It's not because I'm a soft matter physicist, but I hope it's because I know how to challenge people and to think critically about what that department is doing. And I think that's another thing that isn't explicitly interdisciplinary, but I would really like to make sure that we genuinely mean impact in the broadest sense.
Thank you, Athene, very much. Shifting then to a perspective from government, from Ian.
Thanks very much, James. And I think we live in really interesting times, actually. And actually, I say that in a positive way. You know, I'm old enough to remember back to something called the Rothschild Report, which was produced in the early 1970s. And it says a bit about me that as a young teenager, I was actually reading government reports. Quite sad, actually. But nevertheless, I think we've come full cycle now. I mean, what the Rothschild Report did essentially was to split science funding between basic science and applied science. And very roughly, a lot of the applied science was funded out of government departments, and a lot of the basic science was funded out of research councils. And in time, through time, that model has sort of broken down. And it's broken down for a whole variety of different reasons. Some of which are around a change in focus within government towards funding science as an engine of economic growth, and therefore trying to consolidate science funding into a larger unit to be able to drive that process at a sort of macro scale. Other parts of it around, I think, a sense that science funding, particularly coming out of government departments, maybe hasn't delivered the same value for money that it would if it was going through research councils. And I say that advisedly, but I think it's probably true. It would be difficult to put metrics around that, but my assessment of it is that that's probably one of the drivers. And actually, I don't think there's any bad thing in where we are now. And that may sound like a strange thing coming from a chief scientific advisor in a department that's had its research budget cut by 10% per annum for at least certainly the last 5 years, and that will go on probably into the future. That's really tough. It's really tough to manage that. But there's a quid pro quo in this, in that money is not disappearing out of the system for science research. It's ending up in our new body called UKRI. We call it the Global Challenges Research Fund, and we call it the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. But the reality is that's where the money sits and that's where the focus lies. And I actually think that's the right thing. I think that UKRI as a new body will be an efficient commissioning organisation. I know some people don't like the idea of commissioning, but I'm using it in a very broad sense. But the question for me within another government department, a Department of State that has responsibility for policy delivery in the environment, is how do we influence that process? And it's not a matter of saying, we want money spent in this area, so therefore you will commission in this area. It's a matter of a partnership between those organizations that have responsibility for distributing that funding and the other parts of the government system that have responsibility for actually making the country work in those areas. And right now, I don't think we have an answer to that, and I think we need to allow UKRI to develop. Certainly in my role, I've been trying to build a common understanding between Defra and the research councils, and I've spent a lot of time with Jane as well, talking about what ESRC are doing and things like that, or ESRC are doing. But the important thing is that we need to have a common understanding of what the different priorities are. Now, what can a department like Defra do to help that process, quite apart from just send a chief scientific advisor out with a begging bowl? We can actually be very clear about the kind of research questions we're interested in. And I've spent the last 3 years getting Defra to actually ask the questions at the right sort of level that the research community can actually respond to. The problem I have is just getting the things published. It's really difficult to publish things right now. If anybody wants them, I can give them to you, but I can't publish them right now, which is just a pain. But the reality is we have a very clear set of questions at a high level that Defra would like answered. And we would like to work with the research community to make that happen. Now, I know that I'm speaking from a Defra perspective, but I know that also exists in other departments, the Home Office, for example. There are other departments like the Department of Health that has a significant research budget of its own, and the Ministry of Defence. But many departments, Department of Education, for example, DCMS, don't have big research budgets, but they are dealing with big problems. And these are intellectually interesting problems. They should be interesting to the wider research community. And I think it's for us to express the problems that we have in an intellectual context that can actually engage the research community. And we need to work with that research community to help them align with some of the bigger problems that we see coming in front of us. So what do these problems look like? Well, Defra has published its sort of priorities, but I'm going to give you my view of where I think some of the really big questions sit certainly in the environment area, and of course that interfaces with food. The first one I would have said is resource efficiency. Underpinning that are things around how do we make resources more productive. A lot of the Industrial Challenges Research Fund is I think, being directed towards answering some of that question about green growth, etc. How do we minimize waste and eliminate pollution? We are in real danger of polluting ourselves out of this environment that we're in. We've been quite good at it in the past, but actually some of the really difficult stuff is still there to be done, and I can just point to air quality as one of the problems. And I think underpinning this is, how do we price carbon? Because actually the whole issue about climate change and about CO2 production is a subset of the resource efficiency problem. So that's one area. Another area, I think, is sustainable growth through the food system. We've got to keep food supplies going, and they've got to be of high quality. Whatever happens, this government, and I think all future governments, whatever colour they might be, will have an emphasis on economic growth. And we need to be able to design the food system in such a way that it can actually contribute to economic growth and can be as clean as possible. For every calorie, globally, for every calorie we produce as food, we spend 10 calories of fossil fuels. That is unsustainable. And in order to change things, we are going to have to change our food system absolutely out of all description from what it is at the moment by about the middle of the century. So there's a really massive challenge. Trust in resource use, the resources we use, and this is about supply chain authenticity. We need to be able to trust the things that we buy are what they say they are. And the GM issue comes into this. If we don't want to buy GM, we need to be able to trust that what we're buying is not GM. But if we do want to buy GM, I think we should have that choice. So that's about supply chain authenticity. There's technology like blockchain technologies and things like that that can actually come in there. So I think that's important. I think Jane and Athene mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. Absolutely, we absolutely need to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think government needs to step up to that as much as possible. But I'll finish with a bit of a challenge, and that's that, and this is coming back round to how we fund research. If you look at the industrial strategy as it is at the moment, and if you were then to take the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund and map it onto that green paper, what you're actually essentially saying we will do is we will fund research that is essentially driving supply-side innovation. So we want to make more things that people want, fundamentally. What I say is that we need a shift in some of that thinking. I think that we need more behavioral change in order to deal with the demand side. And if we don't start to cut demand, we will never shift from where we are at the moment about being completely hooked on economic growth and completely hooked on sucking in resources to a situation which is much more sustainable and it provides us with security in the long term. So I'll finish with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. That's great, and I hope we can return to some of those points on the Industrial Strategy Fund, in discussion. Finally, JoAnn, to give us a perspective from the US.
Thank you. I will start my remarks perhaps by giving a little bit of information about the National Science Foundation and try not to use too many initials for everything as well. For those of you who don't know, and perhaps maybe how it mirrors a little bit the research councils, we have 8 directorates. Within those directorates, mostly all of science and engineering are represented. I myself, I'm from the engineering directorate, and one of my colleagues is here, Bob O'Connor, from social, behavioral, and economic sciences. And so as it is, we have these separate directorates. We have one director, France Cordova, who has been with us for about, I think, almost 3 years. And so, like I said, that's kind of our division. We're under one director, different directorates underneath her. Last May, she came up with what we're calling NSF's big ideas. There are 10 big ideas. 4 of those are what we call process ideas. And I wanted to maybe structure some of my remarks around the big idea of convergence. And so I'm going to call it convergence because that's the National Science Foundation language. In your documents, I think you're calling it transdisciplinary research. And so we can argue if there's subtleties between the difference. But the idea of convergent research is one of the process ideas that Dr. Cordova brought about. It's not really a new idea. It goes back to a colleague of mine, Dr. Mike Rocco, wrote a book on this regarding nanotechnology. MIT has done a study on life sciences, physical sciences, and engineering around sort of medical, synthetic biology, those kind of things. And indeed, the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering has done a study on convergence as well and has published sort of guidelines on how do we make this a difference. And I like to talk about some of those, and we can talk further about developing ways to bring people together, workshops. Funding agencies should be prepared to start putting money into these things like we're talking about now exactly to get these things done. I'm really interested in unpacking a little bit more about making it count. How does it count in sort of the bigger structure? So convergent really meaning the grand challenges, or as you call them, global challenges, really are going to require this merging of ideas, approaches, as well as technologies from widely different areas. And I think I'll speak to engineers, since I'm one of those. You know, we talk about interdisciplinary research, so I'm a chemical engineer, and I'm going to work with an electrical engineer and a mechanical engineer. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about social science. We're talking about engineering and perhaps life sciences. And so very widely different areas. And I like to think of it as the whole, the thing you end up with, is really going to be greater than the sum of the parts. And some of the difficulties of how you measure that, how you look at a grant and say, review it. How do we know the whole is going to be better? And so that's something that I think we're still working on. So the examples at the NSF include something called water sustainability and climate. We had a very large program in that where engineering, geosciences, and social, behavioral, and economic sciences work together. We have a continuing grant or initiative solicitation on something called CRISP, and that's Critical, Resilient, Interconnected Systems and Processes. We always have to have a name that spells something good. And that's social, behavioral, and economics, computer science, and engineering itself working together on these interconnected processes such as water systems, energy systems, with the acknowledgement that indeed social systems have to be part of that talk as well. I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about the one that I'm most familiar with, which is innovations at the nexus of food, energy, and water systems. And so if I call it INFUSE, the fuse is not F-U-S-E, it's actually F-E-W-S. And so INFUSE is something that we started last year. We started with a series of workshops trying to bring communities together, bring different federal agencies together to say, what are the scientific questions? Why do this? I think as the first speaker, the keynote really talked about is with increasing population, changes in land use, changes in precipitation, our use of resources is going to be critically looked at, and we need to understand it better and how those interrelate to each other to really use them effectively, use those resources of food, energy, and water. I think of it in my engineering terminology as a system of systems. We have a food system, we have a water system, we have an energy system, but really what we're interested in looking at is this nexus of those systems, those connectivities where food needs water and energy needs water, and how those work out, which is one of the reasons NSF thought it could make a difference in this area, since we have all of the disciplines represented. And we're not really a mission-based agency like the Department of Energy, like U.S. Department of Agriculture. We're really fundamental science and engineering. So What does it mean? As I said, we've had a solicitation looking at models. How do we understand these models? Cyber elements. How might we create data? Solutions. Solutions may be models. They may be social solutions. They may be technologies. But really, what are the solutions for the Nexus and this effective use of these resources? And education. How did we do it? We basically said, in our solicitation, you must do food and energy and water. And you must have 3 different directorates, as we are organized, or vastly different disciplines working on this project. So that solicitation, we just actually had our second one. We just got our proposals in on Monday. And so we've had one piece go through. We awarded 17 grants, somewhere just over $40 million. Everybody had food and energy and water and 3 different disciplines. And a lot of the people had attended workshops that we had, like 17 workshops. So this idea of bringing these communities together to talk about how we might approach this was very important. And we have a couple of international grants, but not a lot, and that's something we're looking at. So to finish up with, we're very excited that next week we actually have our principal investigator meeting where we're going to bring everybody together to not only talk about what work are you doing, but also talk about the challenges of convergent research. How do we bring people together? One of our grants is going to form a virtual hub for graduate students or postdocs who are working in this area, to keep those students together, training them in sort of this language of working cross disciplines. I think we could talk a little bit as well about improvements. How do we judge the sum versus the whole is better than the sum of the parts, and also making it count. And so I'll end with that.
Thank you, JoAnn, very much. Thanks to all 4 of our speakers for good, punchy introductions to these debates for us to reflect on. We've got 25 minutes or so for questions and discussion now before we break. So, as before, let's try and take a few. Say who you are. If you want to direct your comment or question at a particular person, do so. And then we'll scoop them all up and come back to the panel in a bit. We will start here at the front. Gemma, there. And then we'll move along. I think there are roving mics coming. And try and keep your comments short, because there's lots of people who want to come in.
Thanks so much. I was recently awarded a project specifically because I was unfundable by the research councils for being too interdisciplinary. And I'm a physicist, and I was able to demonstrate this due to years of failure at getting grants. So it's all very wonderful. And I'm a physicist who sort of drifted into social science, and my research method is very simple. It's the piñata method. You find an interesting problem and you run around it with a big stick. And the problem, for instance, with the ESRC, not to name agencies, was that they wanted some kind of theoretical purity. So it's not enough to have an interesting question and an interesting topic and have a bunch of different methods to try to think about it. You needed to sort of have, like, you know, to say which branch of sociology you descended from, going back to 14 generations. And that I might be exaggerating a little, but I think that this is one of the issues, is within these different topics, how do we make the space for problem-focused research, and how do you guide reviewers to sort of allow them to say, hey, you know what, this is kind of interesting, why don't we give it a chance?
Great, thank you. Yeah, good question. Gemma, along here. So just say who you are when you ask your question.
I will do. Hi, Gemma Cranston from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Thanks so much for your presentations. I was quite struck, actually, by the distinction between the UK and the US approach, between pure science and not having the sort of advocacy or mission-driven piece within the NCF versus the UK research councils who are taking a big approach to taking application and impact. And we've been working within the Nexus Network to try and bring the private sector into the co-design process so that any of that new research that's developed doesn't just plop out at the end and you sort of say, great, now have a go and use it, and that will create impact. But to say, let's bring and understand the problem context, let's bring that end user right into the beginning and co-create and innovate together. And I guess my question was to maybe hear from both sides of the pond, if you like, was how can we ensure we're creating pure science, but still make sure we've got the impact and we're bringing in, how I understand, transdisciplinarity to incorporate government, business, and academia.
Great, thank you, Gemma. And then just next to you.
Thank you. My name is Charles Seaford, and I'm not an academic, but I work with academics, particularly on impact. My question actually relates to the one here. One of the things I keep saying to my academic colleagues is we're going to have impact. We need more synthesis. We need to pull together different things very actively. And then it turns out that to do that, we have to do more secondary research and more literature reviews. And the ESRC won't fund that. It's not interesting enough. It's not original enough. It's not specialized enough. And it certainly won't do our REF any good at all. So I wondered how, particularly Jane, how the panel thinks that this problem can be overcome. And just in a parenthesis, when we are assessing impact, how we can make sure that it doesn't become an output tick box type exercise, which I'm afraid, in my experience, it almost invariably is.
Great, so synthesis, novelty and impact. We'll take a couple more, one at the back there, and then we will move over this side shortly.
Hi, I'm a research fellow from the Science Policy Research Unit of Sussex University. I'm a young research fellow, so at the beginning of my career, and I am just wondering on how to find a balance, because you talk a lot about application and impact and the transdisciplinarity in terms of mixing sociology and technical science, which I agree, but of course sociology means a lot of things, can be quantitative and qualitative. And when we talk about application and impact, it's a lot about quantitative impact, so it's a lot about this. And also it's about timing. And timing has not been mentioned a lot from you, but I experience as a young career researcher that you have to juggle with very short deadline in projects, very ambitious project with high level impact because we compete on income and timing. So you can imagine how the level of expectation it's on productivity. So my question is how you can ensure quality and also ensure nurturing young researcher to be exposed to context. So meaning reality, which takes time, because I guess the critical perspective that you got is because of a lot of experience in context. So how do you ensure this in these conditions, and how me as a researcher can find the opportunity for that?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, one more at the back over there. And we'll come back to the panel. Yes.
Hello, Anna, student of sustainability at CAT. How does the UK RI funding sit with, and have you even heard of, mission innovation and the Breakthrough Coalition? Because it seems to be the natural meeting point of business, enterprise and research development and demonstration, as spearheaded by David King, Nicholas Stern and Adair Turner from the UK, but with agreement of 20 nations, largely the US and India. That's it, mission innovation.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to the panel and we should have time for another round in a minute. Jane, shall we start with you? I won't go through all the questions again, but there's plenty there for ESRC to respond to.
Absolutely, yes. So I really hear people's frustration about the difficulty of getting grants from research councils, and I think we do have to acknowledge that this is a complex landscape and that there are a number of different things that mitigate against interdisciplinary research, and all of us have got a part to play in trying to break down some of those barriers. And what I mean by that is that, well, people often say the ESRC wouldn't give me funding, and it's quite interesting the way ESRC becomes this sort of monolith, this one organisation. You have to remember that what the ESRC really is, apart from our 12 members of council, is around 2,000 peer reviewers on our peer review college. So yes, as an organisation, we have a duty to make sure that those peer reviewers get plenty of feedback and that they are assessing projects appropriately. But this is partly about the broader landscape, which is at the moment still very disciplinary. And so the point was made about the REF, that people still have to very much submit to one unit of assessment in the REF, which helps to keep the silos going, as Athene was saying. But also journals, that's another area where, you know, the very best economists tend to want to publish in very good economics journals. And again, that mitigates against doing good interdisciplinary work. And then the other bit of the landscape, which we mustn't forget, is the next generations coming through. And when departments hire, they generally want people who can teach whatever it is 101. They don't want necessarily just to have people who are very good at interdisciplinarity. So the real challenge is how we maintain the disciplines while also allowing some scope for interdisciplinary research. And I think there is no harm in saying that there are funders who are better at doing this, and that people will get disappointed by the ESRC from time to time and will then get fabulous funding from Leverhulme or Nuffield or from overseas, and will be able to pursue really good research projects. But one of the points of UKRI is at least to really acknowledge that the research councils need to work much more closely together, and for there to be research funding that is allocated for those interdisciplinary projects. A very practical level, the last point was made about if it's interesting, why don't you give it a chance? We do at ESRC have these transformational grants, which are £250,000 over 18 months and likely to be extended to 2 years now. So we have made an effort to have a different style of funding, a different style of peer review, because we are very concerned that we don't want just very safe research projects to be funded. So I think that's important. And then very briefly on the point about how we make sure there are more syntheses and good literature reviews, the point that Charles Seaford was making. I think there's a real groundswell of opinion about this now, and Sir Mark Walpert, who as some of you will know is the Chief Executive Designate of UKRI, has very much put it on record that he is in favour of more credit being given to these systematic reviews and to reviews in the digital age that can be continually replenished and updated. And in the meetings that Research Council chief execs have had with chief scientific advisors like Ian, it's been repeated to us that what often government departments want is not the single paper latest piece of research, but what ministers and policymakers want is the synthesis. What does the burden of evidence tell us about something? But again, we've got to be aware of the tensions in the system that, as you've said, you know, the REF journal articles don't really reward academics enough for that. So in a digital age, we've got to think, how can we make sure the reward system works to reward what will be really good for a healthy, prosperous, sustainable UK and the world? And that's, we all have, you know, a responsibility to engage in those debates.
Thank you, James. Athene, things that you'll pick up in your panel.
So I said in my opening remarks that I think incentivisation from the REF is hugely important, and I think that feeds into what you're saying. And I think way beyond the interdisciplinarity question, the last question, sorry, it wasn't the penultimate question about you know, what do you do at the start of your career, I think that's really important. And so slightly to deviate, I will do a quick advertisement for the Royal Society's response to the Stern consultation, which is coming out tomorrow, which is trying to take a quite radical view to remove the individual from being at the heart of the REF and making it about the institution and about the UOA and the environment in which researchers are doing research. And I actually think that will, if it were adopted, would make quite a difference, because it would make it easier to feel you could publish nil results or negative results, for instance, and reproduce other people's results, and all these things that people know make a good research landscape, but aren't really rewarded at the moment. I think in terms of how you measure things, we keep coming back to that, and it's really, really tricky. But how you judge things is perhaps something that is easier to do, in the sense that when you have a piece of interdisciplinary work, the reviewers are critical. Jane says this about ESRC, it's true of all the research councils. And back in the days when Dave Delpy was head of EPSRC, he always used to come back to that in his arguments with me, which was that it's all down to you, the community, who do the reviewing. And he has a point. But on the other hand, the committee structure itself sort of always goes to what a physicist would call regression to the mean. So you will always take the safe path, not the risky path. And I think mission statements of research councils talk about adventurous research. You used the word, and yet in reality, it's incredibly difficult to get adventurous research funded because people worry that it will fail. I sit on the Scientific Council for the European Research Council, and they have probably been braver about adventurous research and know that a small proportion will fail, and they've done evaluations. But I would still say it's a single research council. When I joined it, I thought all the problems about joins between research councils will go away. No, of course not. You still have panels and you have joins between panels. So they haven't got it cracked either. But I think they are less conservative. They are more willing than some research councils. But the question of how you measure what is good at the end of the day, and particularly when it's interdisciplinary, I haven't a good solution. My panel will solve that.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll hold you to that. Ian. Well, thanks very much. Well, I mean, just on the question of sort of problem-focused research, and I think it was also related to the question about the division between pure science and science with impact. I mean, in my mind, there really are only interesting questions and not interesting questions. And whether they're cross-disciplinary or not actually shouldn't make any difference. They are interesting questions that we should be addressing. Now, the problem is that that is then mapped onto the structure that we have, which isn't really very good at addressing those cross-disciplinary questions that are in that interesting category. And I just think it's a challenge, and I think Jane has already addressed it. It's a challenge for UKRI to actually come up with a structure that does allow us to do a lot more of that interdisciplinary kind of research and to address those interesting interdisciplinary questions. And actually, looking at it from an inside government perspective, almost all interesting questions are interdisciplinary. You know, they just do not sit neatly within silos, apart from a few like, you know, can we get a vaccine for bovine tuberculosis? But most of them, but even that actually has a social component to it. Because actually, even if we got a vaccine for bovine tuberculosis, would the farmers use it? And so everything is interdisciplinary. So to some extent, you know, going back to what I said earlier on, the current research funding structure doesn't service the needs of the nation. If you define the needs of the nation through the lens of the departments of state that have responsibility for running the country, that's a big if, but if you define it that way, they don't really service it very, very well. On synthesis, I completely agree. I mean, you know, my view is that we haven't done synthesis very well, that we're getting a lot better at it, and we need to put a lot more money into it. It is not cheap if it's done well. And we have a massive scientific literature out there. Do we make good use of it? No, we don't. We really don't. And I think it's got a doubling time of about 7 years or something like that. So, and what's more, it's becoming even more accessible through search tools and that sort of thing. So, you know, we are not making use of the investments we've made in the past in scientific research to inform ourselves in the present. And we need to do an awful lot more about that. And finally, I'll come to the point raised at the back about how do you get experience? Come to Defra for a while. It'll put your feet on the ground pretty quickly. You know, I came in as an academic researcher, and I came in as an academic researcher who'd done a lot of stuff around policy. And I'm always impressed just about how easy it is for me to become theoretical. You have to get your feet on the ground. You have to understand what it's really like for people making decisions there and then, and they have to make them, and they have no choice, and they have to use the information that's just around them. There is nothing like that learning experience to get a future researcher in a frame of mind about really solving real problems.
Thank you. JoAnn, do these points resonate with the US?
The first thing that I should point out that I neglected to has to do with my talk about mission-based agencies versus NSF. And actually, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is a partner with us on Infuse. They were, as well as water sustainability and climate. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is to bring in mission-based agencies to work with us so that we're doing fundamental science. They might take other pieces of it, fund those separately, or look at helping us fund some of the more maybe applied pieces of research. And so that's one way that we're looking at it. The NSF has two criteria, broader impacts and intellectual merit. And certainly broader impacts speaks to what is the impact beyond just the merit of doing the science. And we think of something like Infuse as use-inspired research, that it's still very fundamental, but perhaps it's more use-inspired. I don't want to misrepresent what we do. I can give you an example of my division. So there's 5 divisions in engineering. I'm in charge of one. I have about $180 million, let's say, and less than 20% of it goes to initiatives that are interdisciplinary, such as Infuse or CRISP or these things. The majority of my money goes to single or 2 PI, principal investigator grants, that are looking at very fundamental things. We have a big place in what we call career awards. That's targeted toward young investigators and trying to get them a jump start on their career. They're longer, they're $500,000 5 years versus a $300,000 3-year award. And so we do a lot of maybe single investigator, and certainly I've heard a million times, you have never funded me, and it just doesn't fit perhaps. So we have that problem as well. The last thought I had was on the idea of innovation. And one of the things that NSF has done over the course of several years is something we call Innovation Core. And it's out of our IP, Innovation and Industrial Partnership Division. So I said we have 5. And that's where our small business innovation research grants comes from, as well as this idea. So if you have a core program grant, small grant, then you go to boot camp and you learn how to create a business plan, you learn your elevator's pitch, you've got to find 50 companies, and you as the grad student go, and your research professor goes with you as well. And so together you create perhaps innovation, which I have heard from several people that in the process of doing so, sometimes changes the research you're actually going to do. And so their teams, you can you get like $50,000 or something to go and do that. So that's one way we're trying to really get some of this fundamental work that we're doing outside of us.
Excellent. We are out of time. I'm being told very firmly from the back. So sorry we weren't able to take more questions, but hopefully the speakers will be hanging around over the tea break, and you can continue the conversation with them one-to-one. We have tea now, then we're breaking into 4 parallel sessions, as you'll have seen. One of those sessions is in here, the one on the political nature of sustainable prosperity. The other 3 are elsewhere, and I'm not going to try and tell you where, because I don't know this building well enough, but there will be numerous helpful people to point you in the right direction for the Thames Room 1, 2, and the Westminster Room. Before we break up, please join me again in thanking our 4 speakers, Jane Elliott, Athene Donald, Ian Boyd, and JoAnn Lighty.